Okay, hello? Yes, I think we're going to get started. So thanks everyone for coming and welcome to Bathurst and TSP. This is a co-hosted event, maybe hopefully one of many in the future that we'll collaborate on together. So I'll just say a few words about our guest speaker, Helen Mills. So Helen is the founder of Lost Rivers and the Lost Rivers Walks under the auspices of the Toronto Green Community, which is a nonprofit organization that has inspired and supported diverse communities in developing an environmentally sustainable city through education, engagement, and joint neighborhood initiatives since 1995. Lost Rivers is based on the concept of the blue-green city that integrates water management and green infrastructure with community involvement. Helen has also co-founded two related social enterprises focused on the blue-green concept. The Rivers Rising Walks are community-led neighborhood walks through local watersheds and ravines, grounded in the historical connections between people, Indigenous, settler, and immigrant, places, and politics. Rainscape TO is also a social enterprise that creates beautiful earth-friendly gardens and rain gardens that capture water and prevent runoff. Rainscape TO increasingly incorporates traditional Indigenous ecological knowledge and practices as more Indigenous staff join the team. The long-term goal of Rainscape TO is to become an Indigenous-led and run social enterprise. So we welcome Helen.
Greetings, everybody. It's great to be here. This is my first go around doing the Zoom thing, and I don't have my usual screen in front of me that I'm used to, so we'll just see how it goes. And you'll just have to, I hope you'll forgive me if we get confused or things happen. Oh, okay. Yeah, we can put up a picture for sure.
I see her first slide. I think it just got off the box. Okay, it'll just take a minute to rev it back up.
Well, while it's warming up, I'll tell a story instead. I will say that I came to Toronto in 1969, and I'd noticed the strange park near where I was living, which had the sunken playing fields, a flat bottom, and these squared off edges. And I sort of filed that under, that's just the way Toronto is. And then along the way, I was a courier and I got to know the city really well. Then I went back to university and took a course on physical geography and discovered that these strange parks like Christie Pitts are actually old quarries and brickyards and the site of lost rivers. So I was just flabbergasted. And I also discovered that sometimes the only sign of a river is little deviations in the grid. And there was one particular spot where I used to fill up with gas at Sherbourne and Richmond and drive off the tanks kerplunk into a curving laneway and give myself whiplash. And I discovered that that was the ravine of Tattle Creek. It was just a tiny fragment that was left. And I wanted to do blue lines over the road and over the buildings and down the other side, and name them and bring them to the surface of our awareness. And that project sat on my back burner for 10 years. And then one day I was buying yuppie food in Pusaterry, and I walked out and there was this really hokey little green poster. It said, "The greening of North Toronto, come to a community meeting, tell us your dreams." Off I go. And I got into this meeting. And it was the fact that it was my backyard and my neighborhood that allowed me to finally do something, besides having learned things at the U of T. And so that's the beginning of my long relationship with the green community. Got into a group on water, said, let's find out where our rivers are. We were in the very park that I first met Mud Creek as a playing field. And the whole thing began. So we can flip along. I'm not doing the land acknowledgement, but I just put this up because I want to talk about land and water acknowledgements. And that's a picture of the Great Lakes with all their names in Anishinaabe, I believe, from the Indigenous Atlas. And you can go to the next one. And this is the territorial claim from the Mississaugas of the Credit. Are you hearing me all right? Yes. Regarding the fact that they have never ceded any water rights. So to me, that's incredibly important. And my understanding is the main reason for doing this is about protecting the water. So next, this is the rivers of Toronto in 1802. So we, at this moment, we are about there, roughly. Next. This is now. This is now. So, what does that tell us about our treaty with the Mississaugas of the Credit and what has been happening with water? So we can go to the next one. This particular talk was actually inspired by a presentation I went to by a guy called Joe Brewer, who lives on the edge of a mountain in Colombia and is working to restore a 100-kilometer square watershed. So he came here and gave an amazing presentation talking about the concept of territorial restoration. And he gave us a way to relate to it by talking about what happened in Toronto with David Crombie and the Royal Commission on the Waterfront, because it was a complete revolution in thinking to forget about the municipal jurisdictions and the federal and the provincial jurisdictions and just say, look, we have to look at the ecosystem as a whole. We won't fix the problems down here unless we understand the whole water system. And so that was a nod to what we have been doing here, and you can keep going. So let's just begin on a very big scale, and we're going to zoom back to Toronto in a minute. And this is about how we divide up land, colonial settler states, indigenous territories, ecoregions, watersheds. And if you go to the next one, next slide. Oh, okay. Yeah, this is all right. This is the watersheds of North Toronto. Who knows what a watershed is? There's 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, wow. Okay. So does one of you want to take a stab at it? Good, I have a victim.
The green line, that's about 100 kilometers outside of this area. So I know where that is.
Wow. Yeah. So basically, this is saying the big red line is in the Rockies, and everything to the west of that line falls into the Pacific, and everything to the east of that line goes either into the Arctic or the Atlantic Ocean.
I mean, the water flows this way.
Yeah, because you know what? Water's strange, but it falls and gravity is operating. So it always flows down. So it's always going from high to low. And the watershed is the area of land that's capturing all the water and it's flowing down into a river. And they can, there's every scale of watershed, but that's North America. And this is Canada, and we live here. We live in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence watershed. People often say Great Lakes, which is also true, but actually all our water ends up in the Atlantic via the Gulf of St. Lawrence, okay? And this is just a close-up of the Great Lakes in that context. And you can keep going. And this is the scale. If you put the Great Lakes on top of Europe, Warsaw, Vienna, Marseille, and London. So it's enormous, yeah. And this is the indigenous peoples of the Northeast in that approximate area. Don't bother trying to remember any names or anything. It's just to, again, create a different sense of the place that isn't just based on that first colonial boundary map, okay? And this is us on Lake Ontario. The red dots are things called areas of concern, and I'll talk about that later. And this is the indigenous peoples around Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. I would say before the War of 1812. Because a lot of those guys moved north after the war. And this is a map of the 3 trade portage routes in Toronto, the big ones. And this is our bioregion. And one of my realizations is, this is not just a bioregion. This is a biocultural region that's been here for 15,000 years in different forms. And that throughout that time, humans have been interacting with the natural world in different ways and making imprints of more or less environmentally friendly nature. But there's deep knowledge and influence that comes down through that whole time. So as we move from the Greater Toronto bioregion, we're moving into the more local situation. So this is really the story of Lost Rivers. So what we did is we came along right at the time that the Crombie Commission was publishing their report, and I was absolutely gobsmacked. And I took all that and the 40 Steps to the New Dawn, and I said, okay, so this is a neighborhood group. Can we figure out what our local lost rivers are? So we looked at the GTA rivers, and then we looked at the Don watershed, which is the next slide, sorry. And we found our neighborhood, which was there. And then we went and we figured out the creeks. And next we figured out their watersheds. And this was a hand-drawn thing by Ed Freeman, who is an incredible geologist and leader of many walks for Toronto Field Naturalists and Heritage Toronto. So those were our creeks, and they all end up in the Don. And then we got fancy and we got a website with hand-drawn maps by Peter Hare that also showed the sewers. And this is actually Tattle Creek, which is just up the road from you guys. So I think you are here, and there's a dotted line, and the red lines are where the water is now. And then we're looking at the Ward 11 creeks, because that's how I came to this room, was through a presentation to Green 11 through Anne. And that was Tattle Creek, by the way, at least Castle Frank Brook. So in Ward 11, there are 7 creeks, creek fragments that flow through Ward 11. But let's get down to the neighborhood, which is the next slide. Oh no, we have history first. So this is it's a map showing some of the archaeological sites in Green 11, and the Davenport Road and the Lake Iroquois shore cliff, which is this line here. So that was an ancient lake. So Davenport Road was a beach 12,200 years ago. And it's believed that many of the earliest archaeological remains are actually under Lake Ontario, because there was an in-between lake level that was really low. Okay, and this is the local, and this is the one with the wonky labels. I couldn't find it. I fixed hundreds of others. Okay, so this is the ancient trails in our neighborhood. The most important ones being the Davenport Road and the Lakeshore, and the road to Yonge, which was around Parliament. And then there were a bunch around High Park. Okay. And this is the watersheds for this neighborhood. And again, that triangle is the "you are here" triangle. So this church is right on the watershed boundary somewhere between Tattle and Russell, actually. But I included Garrison because it's close by and it's sort of part of everybody's mental map, probably. So those are the 3 creeks. Just want to quickly mention the creeks come as part of an ecosystem. And these were the different forests of Toronto, more or less, the different ecosystems, with many, many minute, amazing, individual situations. But those are the big picture things that you could look at. And the Oak Savannah, of course, is famous for being managed through fire by the Indigenous peoples. And this is a historical neighborhood ecosystem. It was a pine oak forest, pretty certainly, maybe with patches of Oak Savannah. And those are just some of the creatures who we know were here. That's a picture of Tattle Creek. And that fish is a brook trout. And there's a historical description of Moss Park Creek, which is a tributary of Tattle down near Queen, describing how great the fishing was in that little creek. So we know that this is one of the fish that was in these creeks. And just again, to locate the church, and that's the last woodlot. By 1851, it was the only one left between here and Bathurst. So that was, you know, the loss of the creeks and the loss of the woodlots was a package deal, you know? Okay. So we're on to part 2. Wow. So this part, we're talking about the demise of the creeks, and we can just keep moving. The first thing that happened is that, again, a surveyor came to Toronto and divided up the land into a grid. And then the land was given out to people who needed land for various reasons, who ran away from the Civil War, and were rewarded in different ways. And they were all given these huge amounts of land. And this particular 100-acre plot belonged to John McGill, and around 1834, he subdivided. So that is a subdivision map. And very soon after any subdivision map in Toronto's history, those rivers begin to disappear. So they were not conceived as a whole. The river was conceived as John McGill's Creek. And Henry Scadding remarked that it was so amazing that the little creek at Gore Vale is the very same creek that runs into the lake at Fort York. And so that property framework was so powerful in people's minds that these were just little creeks that were there. There was no sense that there was a whole watershed system. So during that same time, as they were subdividing and putting up fences and cutting down trees, it was a very traumatic, horrendous, difficult time for the Mississaugas, who were kicked out of their fishing grounds, kicked out of the market, and were basically starving as their hunting grounds were enclosed and the forests were cut down. So the two things sort of go together. And at the same time, there were many starving paupers coming from Europe who were losing their homes through land enclosures. And one of the things they brought was cholera. And cholera eventually, and typhoid, led to the discovery that those are waterborne organisms after many, many epidemics. And that led to this whole public health campaign in Toronto, in which we got sewers and a water system. And that is a woman on Tattle Creek at Elizabeth Street getting her drains put in. So we ended up with this huge sewer system. This is Garrison. It's a famous picture by Michael Cook. Really magnificent architecture. The other thing about ravines and rivers is they weren't good, useful, saleable real estate. So it was considered to be a really good idea to fill them in. That's 796 dump sites, not on the Ministry of Environment's website, that existed in Toronto, probably from early times, and mostly on ravines. Okay. There you go, filling in a ravine. Next. This I love because the title is Horses and Men Who Are Making Real Estate Out of Ashbridges Bay Marsh. So they're engaged in the process of filling in the marsh. And this is, if you get a chance to have the PDF, you can read this. But these dump sites were described by the Globe as sponges of putrefaction. But if you cover them up, you could use the land. Okay. So we actually did eventually get rid of cholera and typhoid, which people around the world, many would be very happy to have that same privilege, but there were unintended consequences. So this is a few river rising ambassadors at the pipe that brings all the water from North Toronto to the North Toronto sewage treatment plant. And all those old sewers that were built were combined. And what that meant is that every time it rained, they would overflow and all the poop would land in the rivers and the lake. And that's how Toronto got to be an area of concern under the International Joint Commission of the Great Lakes. And Canada signed an agreement with America that they would clean up these things. So we got this huge mandate to fix. And that happened in, I think it was in the 90s. I'm very bad at dates though. But this is some of the heavy-duty, fuel-driven infrastructure in Toronto that takes up 1/3 of our energy budget. And this is the unintended consequence. This is the Don mouth at the Keating Channel. And the Great Lakes Stress Index. Lake Ontario is in the red. It's not a good scene. Okay. And this is all our really bad report cards for the rivers. So this led to this big thing with David Crombie and the Toronto Region Conservation Authority and the International Joint Commission, and they all got put in charge of the remedial action plan for Toronto along with Toronto Water. And that was using this approach, that in your thinking, you need to include environment, society, and the economy. And I probably don't need to say a lot because I bet you guys have seen this and probably many other diagrams that have made it more, okay. And it was the rise of watershed consciousness. So this is the watershed wall at Evergreen, which shows the rivers, and there's a lovely little plaque that talks about the rivers. So the Lost River map is on there, but you wouldn't see it at the scale. It's just the little river. Yeah, it's okay, that's fine. So there's the watershed, we've done that already. You can keep going. And this is the difference between a natural water cycle and what is happening in the city, which is the next slide. So all the problems we have in the city have to do with that built environment and the fact that there are so many hard surfaces and that the water isn't able to soak into the water table and feed the rivers, and it's evaporating. And because it's moving fast on the smooth surfaces and picking up oil, salt, gas, doggy doo-doo, and rushing into the rivers at top speed, it's ripping them apart, destroying habitat, creating pollution, and a lot of sediment being uploaded into the river. So that's what has to change. Okay. So the solutions. One word is blue-green city. Let's just jump in. So that's what the idea of a blue-green city is. And again, it's all of these are very, they're not really things, they're things that cities do and engineers do, right? But the basic idea is also stuff we can do as individuals. Are you okay if I just go to the next slide? Okay. So here's some of the great stuff. Daylighting rivers means getting it up from under, taking off the lid on the sewer. This is in Zurich. That's in Vancouver. And the bottom one is the plan for the new mouth of the Don, which is actually happening. So that's such exciting stuff and was unthinkable at the time that I started Lost Rivers. You would say the word daylight and people's eyes would glaze and they'd sort of look away and change the subject. And now it's different. So this was the plan for Garrison Creek, which didn't happen. And it was a classic Toronto democracy thing. There were fights between the baseball people and the people who had wanted to do other things in the ravine. So many, many other things happened, and it didn't. It just, what they did with Garrison was they culturally daylighted it with art and little roadside plaques and sometimes some tree planting things. Okay. Mud Creek did get daylighted at the brickworks. Better Homes and Garden restoration. This is the concept for the Lower Dawn, which is ongoing as we speak. And this is another Lower Dawn image, and one more. Oh, I dumped the last one, it's okay. So just in case you think this is nature with a capital N, this is how it's really happening. Here's the side order of engineering. So there's a huge new pipe going in beside the Don, and another one along the lakeshore. And the top pipe is coming from Taylor Creek, basically. And it's also called the Coxwell Diversion Tunnel, because there was a crack in the Coxwell trunk sewer that led to Ashbridges Bay. And so this is our service area. There's 1.2 million people, 267 kilometers squared. And Toronto Water has the job of managing everything that comes into our taps, that goes down our toilets, and all the natural systems are managed by TRCA in partnership with Toronto Water. There's other heroic engineering that is very interesting from a climate perspective. This is the Deep Lake water cooling system, where they're bringing in cold water from on the other side of the island. They put it through an energy exchange thing, and then they use the water to cool the whole of downtown Toronto instead of air conditioning. And then they put it back as drinking water, and it's 8 degrees hotter than it was. So they're not putting hot water back into the lake, or not directly, right? So I find that to be just amazing. And this is a new one. It's even more amazing. They're harvesting heat from sanitary sewage for Toronto Western. And this is eventually going to result in them being 100% fossil-free. And the deep lake cooling is already reduced Toronto's footprint for cooling by 90%. So these are all, and you know, this, if they did this, I think it's equivalent to 44,000 cars. That's how much carbon that they're saving through the system. So it's very, very interesting. Okay. What is happening with that sewer system, the water system, is that there is an energy footprint. It's 30% of the city's electricity budget to pump the water uphill from the lake, to pump air through the sewage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of pumping that goes on all over the place. And somehow, though, water never made it into the city's transformed TO plan. There's all these other headings, but the word water actually isn't anywhere. So we can go to the next one. But in actual fact, there's this very profound connection between water, food, and energy called the water, food, energy nexus. So water is used to make energy, right? But then energy is used for water. Sorry, just go back for 2 seconds. There's a huge water footprint for the food we eat, but the food we eat is also very much connected to the broken nutrient cycle that we're going to talk about. Okay, so let's go now. So instead of looking at climate change in terms of carbon. Let's think about Earth systems, which are the geosphere, which is the Earth, the biosphere, which is all of biological life, the hydrosphere, which is water, and the atmosphere, which is the air. And the next slide is about planetary boundaries, which has identified processes more than just one thing to measure. So that's in 2009. It's a very clear slide, so I put it up. And already by 2009, we were in very deep trouble with the nitrogen cycle and biodiversity loss. So the nitrogen cycle is to do with the fact that fertilizers, nitrogen fertilizers, get made in chemical plants, and they're used to make the food we eat. 51% of the proteins in our body mass come from a chemical factory, right? So that tells you something very profound about our food system. Then we pee it out, goes to the sewage plant, gets cleaned up a little bit, but the sewage plants in Toronto all still send nitrogen and phosphorus into the lake. And the farms that use the nitrogen have runoff that gets into the lake and causes algal blooms. So we're treating a nutrient as a pollutant, where we should be cycling it back into food. And that's one of the ways that we have a very broken biogeochemical cycle. So next slide. This is just how many boundaries were crossed planetary. So by 2023, we were up to 6 boundaries. And you can go to the next one. So that's the trouble we're in now. I'm not going to go into the weeds. Next. So these are just maps about phosphorus levels in the Great Lakes. And the next one, nitrogen levels in the Great Lakes. So all these things are so tied up together. Next. Now we're getting into fixing it, finally. And I've lost track of time, Anne.
I don't have a.
Okay.
Let me look at this book here. What time is it? Oh, it's 5 to 1.
Okay, so I'm late.
Well, we didn't get started till.
Okay, good. I have a little time. We'll be fine. We'll be fine. So let's go to the next slide. I put that buzzword up. Oh, okay. Sorry, you guys missed the fun part.
But we are recording it, so.
Okay. So the buzzword is distributed change. That's what we're doing in neighborhoods, right? And it's neighborhood greening. Gardeners are a big part of this. So we can go to the next slide. Keep going. That's just a list. So first thing is rain gardens, obviously, because I'm a rain garden fan. They're just little depressions in your front yard that capture the water from your downspout. You plant them with pollinator plants and trees, and they keep water from going into that nasty stormwater system. So they're reconnecting you to the natural system. Next. And preventing runoff. Next. And that's a rainscape rain garden. And it's interesting because we didn't know that they actually had a sump pump bringing all the water from the back to the front. So we planned the garden for X amount of water, but there was a lot more coming in. We planted a tree, problem solved. One tree. You can't really see it in that slide, but it's there. Okay. 32 small rain gardens sequester 1 ton of carbon, roughly. So imagine if there were hundreds and hundreds, make a huge difference. and an Olympic swimming pool of water. Okay. This is really great for this neighborhood. And here is the first, easiest, immediate action that's available. There's this bur oak, it's a heritage tree just down the road, and there's a big campaign to save it. And there was actually a CBC story about it today. So I put in the link for Harvard Village, where you can go and donate or get involved in working in other ways to save the tree. Okay. Mini forests or pocket forests are the new rage in Canada. And they're just little tiny forests that you can fit into a corner. And the original idea was developed by a Japanese scientist, and he designed them so that they would grow very fast, be planted very densely, and would have a huge amount of biodiversity, all in a very short time. The National Healing Forest is something you might be really interested in as a church. It's an Indigenous settler partnership. And if you go to the next slide, this is the National Healing Forest at St. Matthew's United. And obviously in a moment of ceremony. And this is the first city-built mini forest that's coming down at the Portlands, where the new Donmouth is going to be. Okay. And this is another neighborhood project on Palmerston. There's a forestry guy who saved a bunch of oak seeds and planted them, and he has this little baby oak nursery going.
That's his front yard on Palmerston.
Yeah.
It's impressive.
And there's actually,
It's like 1,000 oak trees.
yeah, 3 or 4 front yards that have little plantations on them. So mini seed forests, these are. And then community gardens are always great, right? And this is the food cycle that I was talking about, how in forests everything goes through a cycle, and all the nutrients become food for the plants, and then the plants provide food for the herbivores, and the herbivores provide food for the omnivores, etc. So just going to the next one. The idea of a food forest is to copy that. And the idea of permaculture is to copy nature and have those layers in your garden. So many community gardeners are doing things like that. This happens to be a community garden in the West End. Depaving paradise. You like that? Me too.
Yes.
So that's a rainscape depave. That was in the East End. You can keep going. And that's the after. Keep going. This is the local depave. This is at Markham in London, at the Monsignor somebody's school. And it started out as this horrible parking lot. They did little itty-bitty plantings and community visioning. Eventually they got a plan with the city to depave it and turn it into a park. And then this is some of the kids that helped to dream it up. And this is the new reality compared to the parking lot. Green laneways. Lots of opportunities in this neighborhood. You can go to the next one again. This is just the laneways around Russell Creek. So there's so much potential, and that you can go to the next one. That's, yeah, keep going. And this is Montreal's Green Alley movement. And so you can see how amazing. And they've done so much amazing work, and we really haven't even scratched the surface. So I'm really excited about what could happen with that. And then finally, I want to talk about going big again. If you go to the next slide, the idea of Sponge City. This is this amazing Chinese architect who, you know about him, yeah, who looked at the situation, remembered the peasant water technology from when he was growing up, and came up with a concept of Sponge City, where you trap water at the top of the watershed as much as you can, and then you do things along the way to slow it down. And then at the bottom, you also have big marshy areas where it can be cleaned before it enters rivers and lakes. So that's very much the idea that Toronto used for the wet weather flow master plan. So they were thinking about the headwaters, the transmission, the channels, and the end of the pipe. But they did it all with pipes in the end, with just these surface changes like the Don Mouth. And the reason for that was that they did the math and they figured that the natural systems would do about 95% of the water cleaning that was needed, but the other 5% could only come with heavy engineering. But unfortunately, the heavy engineering costs like 95% of the budget. So they put 5% towards the community stormwater greening. And then in 2013, there was the big flood, and there were so many basements and buildings that were just wrecked. And they said, whoops, we forgot to calculate for climate change. And so they took the money away from the community stormwater program and put it into the basement flooding protection program, which is more of these big underground pipes and tunnels. But, you know, eventually this is all probably going to work, but I like this guy's plan. Okay, so now we have patches of forest in an ocean of city. And all those green dots you see, if you drew lines through them with a pencil, you'd have a lost river. So my question is, how do we connect the dots? Okay, next. I have this dream of a national park because Downsview is the headwaters for 12 creeks. So I imagine Downsview being the headwaters and the national park extending through the matrix of creeks. And I imagine a 200-year plan for an emergent urban ecosystem in which, and you know, where connections are made. Mud Creek crosses the 401, and I used to go to the 401 and just stand there and go, right, how are we going to get over this? Because you have to walk for an hour to get around to the other side. But people are doing it, right? They're connecting things. Next. So there is the Downsview. Actually, it stopped being a national park when Stephen Harper was in, but now it's a designated national park again, an urban national park. And they've just decommissioned Bombardier's lands. So there's a huge development going in there. London is a national park city. Keep going. Stockholm is a national park city. This is the idea. This came from David Suzuki, the homegrown national park on Garrison Creek, connected with the wards, overlaid with the wards that covered the creek. They recruited homegrown park rangers, and the idea was to bring nature home, with neighbors passing seeds to each other. You can keep going. And that's a walk we did with them. Keep going. Pollinator gardens. And they ultimately, it was such a success that they got rid of the connection to the creek and went national. And I was devastated because I still have a vision that we can do this as individuals in our neighborhoods we can begin to knit the city back together, backyard to backyard, with, if you want to call them park rangers, or the city has their nature stewards, but people who work together to animate a process. And an amazing event happened in 2022 where daylighting became policy for the city, which is, it took me a month to get over the shock. And the Lost River maps show up now in all kinds of city plans. I'll skip that part because I've kind of said it. Finally, for the dream to begin, again, gotta be Indigenous led. And I dream of walking trails along the creeks that tell the story, the deep story, from the first peoples through the settler community and the many different immigrants that have come and keep coming, and their stories and their knowledge of water. And that we create a shared, have you guys heard of the shared trail on the Humber? It's a path between the Indigenous community, the French community, and the English community on the Humber River, along the trail, the Carrying Place Trail, the ancient trail that ran along there. So why can't we have shared pathways along all the lost rivers and slowly begin doing reconciliation and reconnecting to the land, putting in pocket forests, rain gardens, pollinator gardens, all the usual green housing things that we all know something about, I hope. That's my dream.
Thank you so much, Helen. You can see that Helen's been thinking about this for a very long time. That presentation did not happen overnight, so thank you so much. We have the space till 2, but we're hoping to let people leave by around 1:30. It's almost 1:10 now, so we'll take a little bit of time now if people have any burning questions for Helen, including the folks on Zoom. So we're going to let people speak into the room from Zoom if you have any questions that Helen can answer for you. Oh, please remember to unmute yourself. Don't see any questions? Oh, in the chat. Maybe people have put their messages in the chat. Okay. Does anyone here have a question for Helen?
It's not a question, but I was hoping that we can isolate this particular event and highlight it on the website of the church and let people know about it, so they could hear this. If they're not here, it's a small group here that they could hear the whole presentation. I don't know if that's possible.
I think Helen will be doing this talk in different venues and might have some proprietary, but I don't know.
Oh, no. I want to share.
Yes.
I have one additional thought. I did many years ago with Green Neighbors 21. We did a talk with the TRCA and Mariko, who does she has a little book about infrastructure and water. So we figured out all the rivers and the infrastructure from St. Matthew's Church. And then we did a design charrette where we sat down and we brainstormed neighborhood projects. And of course, Lee came up with a site that needed a rain garden. And in the end, it was on city land and the city built it, which was good because it was really technically complicated. But I love that idea of getting together, brainstorming about what the needs are of the local community and what people want to do. That's all. That's a good final thing to say. Yeah.
Thank you. So Jean has a couple of announcements before we break.
Carrying on with the water theme, I had an email yesterday from a longtime colleague of mine in Greenpeace. Beverly Thorpe, lives in Toronto, down almost in Lake Ontario, but she has been working on issues of chemicals in water. I noticed you talked about that too. And she was writing to engage some of us with her work. She's going to be on TVO tonight at 7 o'clock. It's a live conversation, but it's being sponsored by the Water Brothers, which you know is a really fine group here in the city who's been working a lot on issues of water, and it's going to be on the forever chemicals. Beverly Thorpe and a team in Greenpeace years ago started working on the chemistry side of what's happening to our waters. She still works in Canada and in the US, and they have done amazing work. So if any of you have a chance tonight at 7 o'clock to watch the TVO program, I told her that we were having a day today on water and that some people might like to follow this up. The second announcement is that it relates to our long-time commitment in this congregation to divest from fossil fuels and to do a lot of work trying to limit the amount of money in this country, in particular in Canada, is still going into fossil fuels. And I have brought from the Ontario Clean Air Alliance, who is one of our key allies right now in this church, on the work that they're doing to try to prevent the building of new natural gas plants in Ontario. So there's two different kinds of materials that I asked them to send me before today. One is relating to the Portland's gas plant plan. I've got lots of these up here, so I would ask you to look at what the province is wanting to do. And the other is turning our back on renewables in this province, which is a key problem here with the current government. So there's one on that, turning our back on renewals and climate lunacy and expanding this natural gas plant. I could hand them around like right now, or they're up here for your picking up. Yeah. Thanks a lot.
I saw that Lena online had a question. Yeah, Lena, you can go ahead and unmute.
Hi. It seems like such a little question in view of everything that we've been talking about, but just one of the things that has kind of shocked me as a young immigrant, even coming in and finding that people really seem to take a lot of stock on having a green lawn, especially at the front of their house, so that it has to look like a green carpet. And I don't. I don't know. This practice seems to go on, even though it seems to me that it's really unsustainable. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that. That's all.
I guess I have to add lawn replacements to the list of green things. I think it slipped my mind because you can hardly find a lawn in this neighborhood. But what is in this neighborhood is a lot of biologically useless stuff like euonymus and assorted non-native evergreens. So replace your lawn with a rain garden and a pollinator garden and beautiful native trees that are habitat for birds and butterflies. Yes, and really that lawn thing is still a big deal in the suburbs. And it's a process of changing the culture and also resisting the marketing. You know, that is just the tail end of a very long supply chain that begins with those same chemical companies that make the nitrogen and the phosphorus. And they just extended that through the landscape industry into people's gardens and through the home hardware industry into people's gardens. They're just a place for them to dump their weed and feed stuff, which is absolutely the worst. And I think there is a shift occurring, and there is also still an aesthetic about a tidy garden. There's a group that is a joint project between the Conservation Authority and Landscape Ontario that has developed something called fusion landscaping that is eco-friendly, water-friendly, a lot of rain garden, green infrastructure stuff, but they try to preserve some of the aesthetic that people traditionally like of tidiness and edges. And so that's one of the things we learned in Rainscape. You can do these things, and if you do them right, people still feel good about it, and they still look really great. Yeah, grow potatoes on your grass, ladies and gentlemen. There are just so many wonderful things you can do with your front yard. And I think one thing that's helpful, you can now get these pollinator signs to put with your planting that clearly state you're doing it. My experience is when you do have a pollinated garden in the front, it's often very colorful and beautiful, but the butterflies come and the birds come and the neighbors come and they're like, whoa, you know? So it can be a great experience to do.
Thank you.
So clearly, Lena, that was not a small question. I think we're at 1:20 now, so I think we're going to close up the session, but thanks everyone for coming, and another big thank you
Sorry,
to Helen.
Anne.
Oh,
I think Marion wanted to make a comment. Sorry about that.
Briefly,
Marion, yeah.
yes. You notice that the church garden has changed over the years, and we tried pollinator, and we're going to keep it up. So the people who are doing the gardening now are really hoping to get some good ideas, I think, from you. But you notice that our garden has very little lawn left, partly because we didn't have any money for paving, for big paving, for the people to sit down at the table with and to have tea. But still, we're working on it.
thanks, Marion. Okay, thank you so much, everyone. And yeah, please grab an apple or some tomatoes or something from our snack table there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you, Anne, for organizing this for all of us.
Thanks to all. See you next week.
Thank you, Ken, for doing the tech. Absolutely.
Thank you, Ken.
I'll take one of each, and I know what I'm doing at 7 o'clock. Watching the show.
It's at the back of the room. They all fit on that one.